Tonight, day 4 of our conversation about justice in the international realm. And we welcome back David Welch, CG Chair of Global Security at the Balsillie School of International Affairs. This year was the centennial of International Women's Day. Yet, despite all of our progress, there are still many injustices for women worldwide. And into some of those injustices we'll be examining today. Hi again.
Hi.
I want to begin with bringing up some statistics. This comes from the post-conflict situation in Rwanda. During the time, in 1994 genocide, more than 500,000 women and girls were raped, tortured, and abused. 2 million people were displaced, and of those, 70% were women. David, you know, champions for justice for women say that there's really an opportunity here to improve the plight of women in post-conflict areas such as Rwanda during that rebuilding process. But how would integrating women into the political system begin to reverse a travesty like that? Where do we start?
It's a very big question. It's a good one. You start basically by trying to pacify a place so that there's less overt violence, preferably more overt violence, and you can start building institutions and working on social attitudes that protect women from this kind of violence. There's an irony that the world has, we think, at least progressed in terms of recognizing the equal worth of women and respecting their dignity. We have a long way to go still. If you look globally, in no country in the world do women enjoy the same rights and privileges and opportunities that men do. We're doing much better in Canada and in Scandinavia and so forth than many other countries are, but actually nowhere is there a full equality. In these parts of the world, of course, women are increasingly the victims of war. That's sort of ironic because in the old days when war was mostly an interstate thing, took place on battlefields outside of cities between armies formed up in lines, the victims were overwhelmingly men because they were the ones with the spears and the bows and the arrows killing each other. Now most conflict in the world is intrastate conflict, civil conflict, sub-state conflict. And most of the victims, in fact, are women and children. And they're victims not only of traditional violence at the hands of soldiers, being shot at, being bombed, but this kind of thing as well.
In these post-conflict areas, the main priorities are, getting your life back on track, basic necessities like food, water, and security. And given that these basic necessities aren't always met, are people in a position really, practically to do anything about, sounds a bit insensitive, but about the injustices women have and feel?
People being outsiders or people?
Well, internally, governments and the people of the country, and of course the international community.
Yeah, if you look at a war-torn society, you're probably looking at what we call a failed or failing state, which is a government that doesn't have the resources or the expertise or the institutions to actually function properly and provide public goods, including public order and protection for citizens. So you're already looking at places where there aren't a lot of people you could turn to, even if they wanted to fix the situation. So that's where the cry for international help comes in, and that's why there's pressure on the international community to help provide governance functions, to help provide money, expertise, sometimes policing, peacekeepers or peace builders, forces that can stabilize a region so that people can get their lives back on track, NGOs, civil society, sort of an international effort to move in and fill this governance void. That's a healthy development because, frankly, there's no alternative, and if you're going to stabilize a war-torn society, in most cases, you have to do it with a lot of outside help.
If we look inside, we brought up that example from Rwanda, which was sort of in the post-conflict analysis that those numbers came up. When people are dealing in a post-conflict situation, so busy and focused on not only the tragedy, but getting their lives back on track, do they notice, I guess, to put it that way, even the injustices that are happening to women, or is it sort of a post-conflict analysis that we have to look back and see the plight?
My sense is that women notice the injustices being done to women, not all women. It's an interesting fact about some societies that many women are actually accepting of the social orders that disadvantage them personally. We see this a lot, even in our own relatively wealthy societies. A lot of the very socially conservative opponents of women's issues in the United States and Canada are themselves women. But in any part of the world, you'll find a lot of women who buy into the order that has disadvantaged them. You'll also find women who notice that they're being disadvantaged and are acutely sensitive to it and would love to do something about it. But because they're in a context where women in general are politically disempowered and usually also economically disempowered, there's often not a lot they can do about it without a lot of outside help.
You know, Rwanda, many years later now, decades later, women have come a long way in the sense that some of the most important government ministries they're involved in, they make up 56% of the country's parliamentarians, including the speaker. How are Rwandan women in politics transforming that country?
Slowly and not easily, in part because there's still a lot of resistance among men and women in countries like Rwanda to the idea that women should play a very public role and should wield that kind of authority. As time goes on, people become more accepting of it. We have to remember that even in our own society, the idea that women should have political offices is relatively new. I mean, in the lifetime of your grandmother and my grandmother, women didn't have the vote in Canada or the United States. So this is a relatively new development even in our own societies. We can't expect an immediate fix in these countries, but with time, gradually the idea that women are perfectly good in political office does gain traction. And in fact, in some places, people discover that women are especially good in political office because they bring to that job a certain set of concerns that men might not themselves bring to the job. So the more women you have in positions of political authority, the more your political agenda shifts towards I would say social welfare kinds of issues as opposed to strictly economic or security kinds of issues.
Okay, I want to read a quote. This comes from the Sydney Morning Herald, and it was written earlier this summer. And this is what the author had to say about the alleged rape of a 14-year-old girl in northern India. Here's what she said. "The girl's death only proves why India was last week named one of the most dangerous countries for women. The issue of gender abuse and discrimination is exploited by political parties to appeal to their core vote, much like a traveling circus drums up an audience. Gender is not a priority with the national government content with tokenism, such as installing a woman president, Pratibha Patel. Even genuinely well-meaning policies barely scratch the surface. The real issues of literacy, health, empowerment, and security are often lost in the rhetoric." David, is political rhetoric still such a huge barrier in improving justice for women?
Well, rhetoric is one barrier, but there are also real underlying issues here. It's not just a rhetorical problem. You don't just change the language and the problem goes away. You have to change attitudes, and you have to change attitudes at all levels. Now, it's easy to pick on any one country. We could talk about India, and we could talk about how women are disadvantaged there and face certain kinds of perils. But we don't have to say India. We could pick any country in the world, and we would still be on firm ground having that kind of conversation, even here in Canada. So it's not a problem that's specific to any one country. It's compounded in countries such as India by the fact that gender is not the only significant social cleavage. In other words, there are all kinds of other social differences in India that require political care and feeding. Religious cleavage is a dominant one there, Buddhist and Muslim in particular, but there are many different religions in India. Linguistic, economic, caste-based class differences are also political minefields in India. So India is a country with a great deal of diversity on a great many dimensions, and in that kind of context, it's especially hard to focus attention on one particular issue, such as gender.
Earlier in the week, we spent time talking about the ICC and tribunals and this legitimacy. How do you see the international justice system's effectiveness in mitigating abuses against women?
I don't think it's a good story because it's been very difficult for the international community to focus on gender as an issue that ought to be given any kind of priority at the policy level or at the level of setting up institutions and global governance practices. And I think that's because it's easy for people not to notice the systematic discrimination against women because it's part of the furniture. It's part of everyday experience that we all grow up with. And until somebody draws it to your attention, you don't tend to pay much attention to it. So that's issue number one. Issue number two is what we talked about earlier in the week, which are disagreements in different cultures and communities about what actually constitutes a just arrangement, just entitlements, just benefits. And in many parts of the world, people really do sincerely believe that men ought to enjoy a much richer set of opportunities and resources than women do.
Is it our business to try and tell countries that have those views and assist them in integrating women into their political systems?
It's a great question, and it leads to some of the best classroom discussions. And I find that my students often are very torn by this. On the one hand, the impulse is clearly there. We should do what we can to try to promote the livelihoods, the equality of people anywhere, men or women. On the other hand, there's also this contrary tendency to try to defer to some extent to local norms and customs. And it comes together in issues, for example, such as female genital mutilation, which is a cultural practice in some parts of Africa and the Middle East, actually among populations who've emigrated from Africa and the Middle East. So you also find it in Europe, you find it in small scale in Canada as well. So this one is polarizing. The very term, actually, female genital mutilation, is taken to indicate you're clearly on one side of that issue, you're against it, we should ban it, do whatever it takes to ban the practice. Others would argue that, in fact, the practice serves an interesting kind of, empowering function among women in certain parts of the world because it's a ritual that's performed by women and girls as kind of a coming-of-age strategy. So this is the kind of case where I think it's especially interesting to think creatively about culturally sensitive ways of getting people to do things differently. And there has been a movement that's been quite successful in some parts of Africa not to ban the practice, come in from outside and preach at people and say, don't do this, this is bad, but to try to transform the practice in a way that makes it more ritualistic and it doesn't actually involve physical harm. And if you can do that, well, you retain the benefits of the community building function of the practice, but you do away with the medical costs and you do away with the excruciating physical handicap costs associated with the more extreme versions of the practice. So that kind of creative walking of the tightrope between cosmopolitanism and communitarianism is something I think we should take much more seriously in a wide range of issues.
Okay, we just have a couple of minutes left, but I do want to talk about something that's very topical, and that's the uprisings in the Middle East. We talked about it earlier this week. How influential has the female voice been in those uprisings?
Some countries, it's pretty clear that women were significant in forcing change, and in Egypt in particular, a significant fraction of the people in Tahrir Square were women, and a lot of the mobilizing of opposition to the Mubarak regime took place through social networking, peer-to-peer interaction among women and women's groups. So you can point to examples of mobilization of women having an important role in effecting change. The story in Egypt after Mubarak's ouster is less encouraging. And pretty quickly, it became a process of and by and probably for men. It remains to be seen whether the political role of women in Egypt will be significantly enhanced as a result of that particular transition.
Okay, we will have to wait and see. Thank you for your time tonight, David.
You're welcome.